Immediately prior to his current role at Barbados Light and Power, he held the positions of Senior Director of Business Development at Emera. Roger holds a Bachelor of Science in Engineering from the University of the West Indies, St. Augustine campus, and an MBA from Durham University. He is a member and also a past president of the Barbados Association of Professional Engineers. We are grateful that Roger is here this morning because when I first tried to get him, the secretary told me he had an overseas appointment and regrettably couldn't come. But he shifted his plans and has decided to be with us, for which we are very grateful. It gives me great pleasure to ask Roger to speak to you. Thank you.
Thank you, Engineer Johnson. Good morning, everyone. The Honorable Wilfred Abrams, Minister of Energy and Water Resources, President Engineer Trevor Brown, Mr. Ralph Busy Williams, Entrepreneur Extraordinaire, members of BL&P, ladies and gentlemen. First, let me thank BL&P for organizing this session. I think it's very timely. And also for inviting me to participate, inviting Light and Power to share perspective this morning. It's certainly a pleasure to be here at this point in time. There's a lot going on in energy, and energy, as the Prime Minister and the Minister have indicated, is going to play a significant role in the recovery of Barbados' economy going forward, and in the recovery and transition plans that have been shared with us over the last couple of months. I wanted to start this morning with a brief overview of the current system that is in operation, the electricity network. And so I have a slide here, and again, a little bit, I think that's the photographer. Okay, thank you, sir. And this is just given at a very high level an overview of the electricity network and the state of things on the ground at the moment. So, energy consumption, 944 million kilowatt hours per year. And I know I'm in a room with engineers, and engineers are very comfortable with the units of power and energy, kilowatt hours and kilowatts. But I thought it might be useful to share, just to make it a little more relatable to the public and the non-engineers, to express the units in a slightly different way. And so forgive me, the engineers in the room. A 40-watt light bulb, and again, begging the indulgence of the LED folks in the room as well, at the back. A 40-watt light bulb left on for an entire day consumes about 1 kilowatt hour. So when you think about 1 kilowatt hour and what it means, 1 kilowatt hour in a day is equivalent to 1 light bulb being on for that entire day. So here, when we say, the consumption of energy in Barbados is 944 million kilowatt hours in a year, that's essentially 944 million light bulbs running for a year. The system peak demand on the island is 151 megawatts, or 3.6 million kilowatt hours per day. Again, not a conventional way of expressing power, but what that is saying is that our peak demand, which is usually around midday, is equivalent to 3.6 million light bulbs being on at the same time. Installed generating capacity, the ability for us to meet that demand, is 249 megawatts, which is 6 million kilowatt hours per day, or what that means is once you don't switch on more than 6 million light bulbs, we can meet that demand. Of course, of that 249, you'll see a breakdown below. There's different plants that contribute to that capacity. Steam, 40 megawatts. There are diesel engines, 113. Combustion turbines, 86. And then there's solar PV, which we own, 10 megawatts. And there's solar PV, which customers own, which isn't shown here, but that's 18 megawatts. Customers own nearly twice as much as we do, and that contribute to the daily demand. Of course, that 10 megawatts of the 249 is only available during sunlight hours, and so the 6 billion light bulbs, once they're not turned on at night, you can meet it and turned on during the day, they can meet it with the solar demand as well. Centralized electricity generation is complemented by 5 megawatts of battery storage. We've recently commissioned the plant, and that's currently being used during the day to arbitrage fuel at times and to provide important reserves to the network, to provide stability to the grid. The intent there is at times where the demand for electricity is lowest tends to coincide with when or drive lower costs of production. and the extent to which you can charge batteries when costs are low, and then discharge those batteries at peak times when costs tend to be high, you're able to extract some value and fuel savings by operating storage in that manner. But ultimately, storage is going to be a critical part, and we'll see in a few slides further. It has to play a critical role in the transition to renewable energy, because most of the renewable energy resources that we will be relying on in Barbados are intermittent sources, and so they need to be firmed up in some way by storage. Either lithium-ion batteries, like the ones that we've installed, or new technologies like compressed air or pump storage, which is also an option for providing storage to the network. I mentioned the 17 megawatts, it's closer to 18 today of small-scale distributed PV. And then the T&D network is critical to bringing it all together. And traditionally, the T&D network would be the poles and the wires, transformers that are highly visible out there. But there's a lot more to it than that. There's protection, there's just stuff indoors at substations and so on that keep things together, running smoothly. Going forward, a lot of work has to be done on the T&D network to facilitate those multi-flows that no longer come from a central power plant, but come from all of the customers on the grid. That's a fundamental shift in how a power network is operated that needs to be evaluated, engineered to facilitate 100% renewable or increasing intermittent penetration of renewable penetration on the network. At the moment, there's about 116 kilometers of overhead and underground transmission, both at 24 kV and 69 kV. And there's just under 3,000 kilometers of distribution lines at 11 kV. We operate at a system frequency, of course, of 50 cycles. And on the map there, the little red dots are our substations that are spread around the island. There's some green dots as well, which are the generating stations. And then what isn't showing is from each of those red squares on the map is the extensive distribution network of 3,000 kilometers that is mentioned there. So that's, at a high level, an overview of what the network is like, what exists today out there. So the minister spoke about the 18th camel. This is the 18th camel, I think, 100% renewables. You have a situation on the island now where all of the key stakeholders are pretty much on board and saying the same thing in terms of the transition to renewable energy and the importance of it. The utility, government, other private sector entities that you hear from today, civil society, BREA, we saw you in the papers yesterday or day before. Everybody is saying the same thing. Perhaps the only thing that we're working on is the timing and how that is actually implemented. But we have the 18th camel, right? We're all on board. We know it is important to the island and it's necessary. And I would go further and say it's inevitable. I mean, it's how technology is improving over time. It will happen anyway. And so what we need to do is make sure that it happens in a way that we extract the most benefits from it as an island. So the 100-100 vision is one in which you're looking at targeting 100% renewable energy and 100% electrification. Those two aspects of the formula are critical because, as the minister pointed out, transportation accounts for 30% of fossil fuel imports. Other business activities and so on account for another maybe 20. Electricity is half of it, half of the pie of fossil fuel imports on the island roughly. So to make a green transition, it's necessary to tackle both halves, not just electricity. We need to tackle those sectors that don't depend on electricity at the moment, that depend on direct fossil fuel consumption, which would be transport largely, but you have laundries and restaurants and hotels that burn natural gas, for example, that have to be part of that solution as well. And so for 100% transformation, you'll need to convert the electricity sector to renewable energy, and over time, the most efficient way is to convert those other sectors to electricity as well. The extent to which electricity is using renewable resources, those sectors become clean energy fueled as well. And essentially that is what the 100-100 vision means. And that has started. It's not, we're talking about it, there's still a lot of work to be done, but quite a lot of work due to the efforts of us at the utility, but similarly folks like BREA, government, both current and past, would have passed new legislation, put policies in place that started things going, started the ball rolling. And as a result of those efforts, we have 27 megawatts of solar on the network, 10 from the utility, 17 from customer-owned systems. There's 5 megawatts of battery storage. There's new grid-scale solar and wind builds between 2019 and 2022 that are fairly well advanced in terms of the planning. Some of them are in town planning at the moment. There's significantly more renewable energy solar on the renewable energy rider solar. These would be systems under 500 kilowatts. Our colleagues at Williams are putting them in furiously. So we had some, maybe 3 or 4 systems last week commissioned, maybe another 3 this week, I think is the target. So the renewable energy rider is moving, and the amount of solar on the grid is growing, which is good. On the electrification front, quite a lot of progress as well has been made. I mean, for a small island, 360 electric vehicles on the road is quite a feat. Many other places, electric vehicles are around. You'll see them far and few in between, but here it's been extraordinary what's happened in a relatively short space of time. And of course, that needs to continue to get us towards 100% renewables. That introduces many new opportunities, vehicle to grid, vehicle to home. I mentioned storage being critical to the transition, and vehicles are essentially storage on wheels, and whenever they're plugged in, and cars are notorious for low utilization rates. I mean, people buy cars and use them very, very little. When you think about it, maybe 80–90% of a car's life is spent parked somewhere, either at work or at home. And so that, in the utility sector, that is terrible. A low utilization, or low load factor, we would call that, is an opportunity waiting to be exploited or grabbed. And certainly transportation with EVs is one that fits that perfectly. What it means as we transition to electric vehicles is that those vehicles, when parked, the 80% of the time, they form an integral part of the grid, integral part of the network, and can be used to help stabilize rather than install dedicated batteries. The batteries that are in vehicles could provide that ancillary service to the grid to help stabilize things as needed, provide load in emergencies when required, and in return, the customers who plug those vehicles in receive a benefit. So it works as a win-win situation for the customer, as well as the customer of electricity, as well as the utility, as an economic way of providing ancillary reserve services to the network. And then a third integral part of the transition is grid modernization. You need to make investments in the transmission and distribution network to allow this new environment, this new framework in which flows are coming from multiple directions to work smoothly and not compromise reliability and efficiency of the network. The traditional grid design is really one flow from one direction, central power plant to a customer. And the new paradigm is one in which the flows come in all directions, really an energy internet, you could call it. And so quite a bit of investment needs to be made there to transform and modernize the grid to facilitate the direction that we're heading in. A lot of work has already started. Advanced meters and communication systems are currently being deployed at the company. We're probably about halfway in the deployment of smart meters. About 130,000 meters should be replaced by the end of next year is the target. And along with those meters is a comprehensive communication network that allows us to manage and monitor energy consumption on the network in a much higher resolution and level of oversight than we would have had prior to having those communication systems set up. What it does as well is it allows you to extract all the value that is coming with the digitalization that we see taking place, the Internet of Things, which refers to all of the appliances and the consumer electronics you have in your home, from the fridge and the stove and otherwise, coming now with IP addresses and being connected to the network, and coming with smarts in them that they can help you manage your energy use. Take signals from the network via the communication network on what energy prices are, and make smart decisions in terms of a fridge, for example, about the defrost cycle, or the stove communicating or oven communicating with the fridge. Those are things that are actually quite common available in electronic appliances that you purchase today. Unfortunately, grids around the world aren't ready to facilitate that yet, but that has to happen. Customer engagement, a lot of work is going on in that area. Again, both by folks like Bria, but us at the utility as well, are making significant efforts to reach out to customers, participate in events like today, to share information, share ideas, listen to ideas, and give feedback on the approaches and different views of stakeholders on what transformation could look like. And then distribution automation is also another key feature going forward. This is, again, another, when you talk about smart grids, it is not just about communication and smart meters, but a lot of key components with smarts built into it. So switches on the network, breakers that will automatically respond to faults and situations that exist and make real-time decisions to improve reliability. So a fault occurs on a section of the network. At the moment, the way protection systems work is it looks for where that fault is and it isolates that section of the grid, and that section stays off until we're able to get to the fault and fix it. With smart automatic switches, you're constantly monitoring a lot shorter spans on the network, and when faults occur, you can isolate smaller areas and redistribute electricity to areas to ensure that customers see far fewer interruptions. And so those are innovations and developments that are taking place that are allowing utilities and grids to operate at much higher reliability levels than exist today. So, and those are things that have started at utility as well. So we have deployed some automatic switches, and we're working at deploying some more later this year as well. So those are just a few of the things that are happening. There's quite a bit, but clearly more needs to be done to move to 100%. And this, at a very high level, gives an overview of what we thought was possible from a 100% transformation. Now, the timelines on this are the longer timelines that squared up with the energy policy prior to the change in administration. The new policy is for 2030, and so these timelines need to be compressed and condensed. But essentially what you see here on this particular chart or table is in the top row, clean generation, moving from 30 or so installed this year to 100% over a period. And in these phases, we had identified some projects like wind farms and independent power producer solar systems, increases in distributed power on roofs that would make up the first phase of transition to get us from 30 to 138, then continued growth to 250. Part of the clean energy solutions that are required, and I'll show it on another slide, would include not just wind and solar. Those are the low-cost ones, but they are intermittent. They need to be balanced with some form of storage. But waste energy, as mentioned by the Minister, biomass, biofuels need to play a part as well, because they're firm sources of renewable energy, and I expect that would be required to get us to 100%. In the middle here is electrification. This is things like electric vehicles that we spoke about. 350, we're at 360 already, and we're not at the end of the year, so that's growing even beyond what we had expected when we were preparing this table sometime back. Up to 2,000 by 2022, 10,000, 100,000. Now, clearly this will need to happen a lot faster than is shown here, and that is possible. I have no doubt that basically what we're seeing with manufacturers like Tesla, GM, being perhaps the two of the leaders, is extremely rapid advances in battery technology and battery costs, which is driving these costs of electric vehicles down to a point where they're competitive with conventional vehicles now. And the manufacturers are all making the switch to electric vehicles. I expect over the next decade that will be the standard car that you buy from a dealer. And then legacy generation, of course, needs to phase away over that period. There may be a need for some sort of firming generation, even at the 100% point. But of course, rather than use conventional diesel, for example, perhaps you're using biodiesel. Biodiesel can be used in the same types of generators. So that's one option. Or it could be another bridging fuel like natural gas. So this is sort of what we saw as aspirational. All of the details into what makes this work, all of the costs weren't necessarily calculated, but this was a sort of part of the vision approach that we took to try to frame it out initially. And there's work going on now. In fact, we are about to undertake another expansion study, which will firm up, at least do some analysis around what the costs are for implementing some of the transition that we see there, and what some of the options are. I thought it useful to just give a picture of what exists today and what 100% might look like. There are a lot of different, you can slice and dice it in many different ways. This is what a typical day during the week, this would be like a Tuesday or a Wednesday in the middle of the week. This is the 3.6 million light bulbs that are on right here, 150 megawatts. Over the course of the day, it works out to maybe about 2.9, because on average, if you drew, brought this down to an average, it would probably be somewhere around here. So 2.6 million light bulbs on for the entire day is what people would have used on a typical weekday. But that's what the profile looks like. It doesn't occur flat. People start going to work, businesses start switching on equipment, air conditioning starts to kick in, temperatures are at the hottest, and we peak. It drops off, people heading home, street lights start to come on, people start turning on stoves, ovens, TVs, lights at home. It comes back up around 7 p.m. and then it falls off during the day. During the night, bottoms out at about 4 a.m. and then it starts all over again. And so when I mentioned storage and the role storage plays, to produce electricity at this point in these early hours in the morning, the cost of producing this is a lot lower than the cost of producing this. And so if you can take some of this, maybe boost it a little bit, a couple megawatts, and store it in a battery, then you take that energy and shave it off of somewhere up here, energy shaving. The difference in the cost, that savings, is what you can use to improve the overall efficiency, improve essentially the load factor of the network. So that's one role that batteries can play. At the moment, this piece at the bottom would be 27 megawatts of solar that is currently on the grid, representing about, this works out to maybe between 4 to 5% of energy sales on the network. And that ties in really nicely with what we see at the end of 2017, for example. 4% of energy coming from renewable energy, predominantly solar, almost entirely solar. There are a lot of different ways. 100% can look a lot of different ways. This is just one. And so this is just for illustration and to maybe help the discussion go in and inspire some thought and debate. There was a report done maybe a couple of years ago, Professor Homer, many people in the room would remember him or know him, and I tried to stick with the same sort of numbers that he would have done in his report, and then determine from that how much storage and how much biomass or firm capacity you would need after it. About 195 megawatts, say 200 megawatts of PV would be what you see here in yellow. About 200 megawatts of wind would be what you see here in green. And you'll notice what happens is that because you have wind and solar together, they're intermittent, you can't dispatch them. There are times when the both of them together would exceed the demand on the network. And so there are two things that can happen there. You dump it and you lose that energy, or you put it in a battery or storage. Ideally, you want to put it in the storage because you don't want to waste value. And so when you see it capped off here, the green capped off at peak, it means that for this particular day, in this particular scenario, because of how I assume the wind was blowing and the sun was shining, it exceeded the demand, that energy went into the battery, and the battery discharged it at times where there was room to discharge it, and it made the most economic sense. So the blue is the battery putting that excess wind or solar back into the network. And then this difference here in brown, which was diesel before, or heavy fuel oil, conventional plant, that could either be biodiesel with the same conventional plant, or biomass or waste to energy. And so this is what 100% could look like. Of course, you could then say 200 megawatts of wind. Barbados, like before, have been trying to build time for 20 years and still not there yet. Where do we get the 200 megawatts from wind? How do we do that? What needs to take place in terms of land policies and town planning? What needs to happen in terms of the rules and regulations for setbacks? Or can we really achieve 200 megawatts? If this comes down to 100, then this has to go up disproportionately because solar doesn't produce at the same capacity factor as wind. So 1 megawatt of wind will produce probably 1.6 times as much as 1 megawatt of solar. So you need 1.6 times the amount, 1.6 megawatts of solar to give you the same as 1 megawatt of wind, something like that, because of differences in capacity factor. So if I drop to 100 here, maybe I'm up to 350 on solar. Then where do you put the solar? How do you site it? How long does it take to build this? Those are the types of questions. How much storage do you need? Depends on that combination as well. Depends on the assumptions we make and how much curtailment that we're willing to accept on the network. Biomass, of course, is, I think, an important part. I've been working closely in Light and Power, and I know a lot of other stakeholders have been working on this, but we've been working on biomass for quite a long time, distributed. It is not by no means an easy path. We're learning a lot as we work together on it about what the technologies are, what's feasible, what isn't, and what the challenges are in installing a feasible distributed small-scale biomass system. But we're close, and I think that is going to play an important role. It has to play an important role because farming and agriculture is important to the island, and we need to find a solution that makes agriculture sustainable for food security, but also helps in the renewable energy transformation. And then waste to energy, of course, solid waste management is a major challenge for the island as well, and it makes perfect sense to find a solution that tackles that as well as energy at the same time. But with this combination, 200, maybe about 60 megawatts of storage, the difference here, you only need about 30 megawatts of biomass and waste to energy to fill this gap, because that, of course, is dispatchable and can run at a very high capacity factor. You can put it on at 30 and pretty much leave it there once the waste and the biomass is being fed in at a consistent level. So that's just to get some, get people thinking and discussion going. But this is by no means what the 100% needs to look like. There are a lot of different ways to slice and dice, and we heard about ocean energy this morning, and a lot of work and research being done here. There's OTEC, ocean thermal energy, again another technology that's been around for a while, and a lot of work going on that provides firm base load renewable energy. So there's no end. Then there's offshore wind. So you could say that the 200 megawatts, the challenge here onshore is solved by going offshore, and that makes sense. The challenge we have had so far is that our water depths fall off so quickly in Barbados that we don't have a technology just yet that is economic. However, I expect within the next 5 years, the first floating offshore, commercial floating offshore wind farm was commissioned this year. Good data and information will come from that. And I expect within the next 5 years, we'll see, offshore floating wind, which will then solve that problem we have with the depth of waters here. Being able to unlock this, and maybe even go well above the 200 megawatts, so that it reduces the amount of other renewable sources that you need to depend on. So for all this to work, this is the final slide. Just thought I'd wrap up with what we consider at Light and Power to be some of the key or critical success factors for the transition to work. And these become even more acute when you're looking at doing it in a much shorter time frame, and we're looking at 2030 now. So that is a significant challenge that's thrown out to all of the stakeholders in the energy sector. At the top here, I have policy and legislation, so it's going to be very important for there to be harmony between the policy and legislation. There are some aspects of the legislation now that I know create some challenges. The one example would be we have the renewable energy rider, and the regulator would have established a rate for the renewable energy rider, but established that as a temporary rate. And my understanding is because in setting that rate, it could be interpreted that there was a bit of a departure from what is prescribed in the legislation for how rates are set. Notwithstanding that, there was a policy in place that encourages the promotion of renewable energy. And so a decision was made to set a rate that would allow renewable energy to grow on the network, but set it temporary so that those issues can be resolved. Once those issues are resolved, a more permanent rate can be put in place that gives greater confidence to investors. So that effort to put a new rate in place that delinked renewables, solar from fossil fuel was important, because it gave some level of certainty. But because it's not fixed for 5 years or 10 years, it did create, or it has created a challenge for many that want to invest in the sector that would be seeking financing, because the financiers want a little more surety about what the income from these systems would be over the longer term. And so that's one example where, you know, getting the policy and the legislation all in sync, the Utility Regulations Act, the provisions in there such that it matches or synchronizes well with the energy policy. That is extremely important to provide clarity and certainty in the marketplace for all stakeholders, customers who want to install, businesses who want to install, and certainly the utility who wants to facilitate and install as well. Partnerships are going to be critical. 200 megawatts of solar, 200 megawatts of wind. Where are you going to put the wind? It has to go on predominantly farmland. And so partnerships with the farmers is going to be important. Partnerships with government in terms of solid waste. So private entities will build power plants that can take waste and convert it into electricity. The waste may be collected by government or maybe another private entity. But going forward, because of the nature of renewable energy, it will require a lot of cooperation, collaboration between several entities. The utility, again, civil society with the role to play there, particularly in public education, which I think has been going really well. Applaud Bria for that. But that is a key feature of the transformation and a key requirement, certainly a critical success factor for 100% renewables. Stakeholder engagement is an important one because you know, while fossil fuel consumption has environmental impacts, renewables are not without environmental impacts, as we are discovering in the work that we're doing with the farmers as well on biomass. And so we need to be out there educating customers on the options, what the issues are, what the social impacts are, what the risks are with wind, for example, and demystify and debunk some of the myths as well that surround wind energy. And we need to do that because public support is going to be critical for us to be able to implement technologies like wind, for example. Flexible regulatory mechanisms, I touched on that a little bit, but just three key things here. The licensing regime needs to be sorted out. You know, again, to create investor confidence, to create an environment where people have some level of certainty about what the next few years will look like. Licenses need to be granted. And that's an area that has taken quite a long time and has been a significant hurdle, I would say, over the last couple of years in moving things further than the 4% that we have on the network now, because we have been working with a number of potential independent power producers for many years that have approached us. We've done a lot of good technical work. We've introduced a grid code several years ago that anticipates renewables and independent power producers interconnecting. We've been able, in many instances, to do the technical work with those folks, but that has stopped short of being able to go any further for two reasons. None of them have had licenses, so there's only so far you can go in terms of the discussion. Contracts, which you typically refer to as power purchase agreements. There's a process that's ongoing, and the regulator is driving that at the moment, and I think we're close, but we don't have, you know, standard forms of power purchase agreements to guide what those commercial arrangements will look like. So that's a key thing that needs to be put in place. And then pricing. Pricing is a key one. Again, a lot of good work was done. Professor Homer, who I mentioned earlier, would have done, I can't remember what the study was called, but it looked at feed-in tariffs. And the thinking there was that to create, again, some certainty and to avoid having to negotiate each time with each individual entity, to look at the broad technologies in a more general way and identify rates for those technologies that will make it a lot easier for the utility and other entities to negotiate contracts. And so some recommendations were made, but those haven't been acted on as well. So these three things, the licensing, of course, the utility needs to have a utility license that goes well beyond the 10 years that now expires. All the investments that are being made in the energy space are typically investments that last more than 10 years. Usually it's 25 to 30 years. Whether it's a breaker, a pole, a cable or overhead line, a generator, solar, These are 25, 30-year investments, and thank you. So licensing, contracts, and pricing, those are three key areas that need to be addressed. Timely permitting. So it took us 6 years to get the permit on Lambert's wind farm. And unfortunately, during that period, the technology changed, and the technology that we submitted 6 years before was no longer available by the time we got the permission. Had new technology, had to redo the environmental impact, submitted it a couple of years ago, and now hopefully it's not 6 years again, but it isn't encouraging right now where we are given what we've done before, because we're just, you know, we made some changes, and yes, we need to do some of the work over, but if it takes as long as it took the last time, then we will always be in this cycle of never really moving. Permitting is critical, and I know many of you in the room have your own projects. There are many engineers in here and are familiar with some of the challenges there, so that's a key one. And then finally, financing. I mean, access to finance is important. If you get a lot of these things right, however, then it makes the financing a lot simpler, a lot easier to do. And so I think I'll stop there and hand it back to President Brown. Thank you very much.